Two different types of weather effects have been added in View 11, and that includes rain and snow. You can add the rain and snow from the Infinite Planes tab, which can be found with cloud planes, water, ground, where we can add snow or rain from there. We can also go up to the atmosphere editor, or atmosphere from the top, add rain or snow, or go straight to the atmosphere editor. And the last tab has been added, which is rain and snow, where we can choose the precipitation type, and then the appropriate settings will be applied. So let's go ahead and take a look first at the snow. And what we're going to see is that a snow material has been added. And basically, what's going to happen is around the camera within the precipitation area, and this is a radius, we're going to have a bunch of spheres generated, particle spheres, which are going to have the material. And this is the default snow material. We can, of course, change this and modify it. And then we have various other settings as well. First, what I want to do is set this up for more of a snowy type scene. What I'm going to do is lower the, going to the light tab, but just taking the light intensity and bringing that down a little. Bringing our light balance a little more to the ambient side. We can go to the sky fog and haze and increase the fog density in there and the haze a little bit. Also bring the sun down a little bit in the sky. So if we go back to the rain and snow tab, what we can do is we can increase a fog boost, which will darken up the scene, adding additional fog. And I'm going to go ahead and hit F11 on the keyboard to open up the timeline. And I'm just going to scrub through to about 4 seconds in and just do a quick render. And we can start to see the snow falling in the scene. And if we take a look in the top view, we'll see kind of a circle around the camera. So basically the area that's effective for the snow is that radius that's defined in the atmosphere editor. Is the precipitation area. So 30 meters in front and all the way around the camera is going to include the snow. The amount of snow is controlled by the snow strength. So if we want to have a lot of snow, we could bring this up to, say, 10. And that's going to increase the amount of particles generated to create the snow. We can see that really filling in the scene a lot more now. We can also adjust the snowflake size. We can bring that up to 2. You can also type in values higher than the sliders permit. So we could have very large snowflakes if we wanted. We could just bring it up to 5 just to see what that looks like. And you can see very large snowflakes now. But that can be useful in some cases when you're using images to control the snowflake and the shape of it, because sometimes when you have spherical mapping, you're going to need a very small snowflake image within the whole image to have it assigned properly. So sometimes you need to increase the scale in order for the snowflake to look proper. I'll go ahead and bring that down a little bit. We can adjust the speed, how quickly they fall. For a gentle snowfall, I find that a value of around 0.1 or 0.2, a lot lower than the slider goes, tends to look a little bit better for just a gentle snowfall. We can also adjust things such as the wind direction and the angle in which the snow is falling. Along with a bit of turbulence and motion blur. And motion blur is going to stretch out the spheres and the particles and also make them a little transparent. Now what I want to show you is one of the things we can do with snow layers and also collisions. I'm just going to set something up fairly simple here, just adding a sphere to the scene. And then I'm also going to add a global material layer to both the ground and the sphere. So let's start by editing the material. We're going to add a layer. And I'm going to add the snow layer from material layers. Set the alpha boost down to 0. I'm also going to the environment tab and just reset these parameters to their full settings. And then I'm going to right click on the snow layer and share the layer. And we can also go to the ground, edit the material, and I'm going to make the ground layer a lot darker, desaturated, so we can see it better. And I'm going to add in that shared layer, snow layer, which we have an independent alpha boost for, also independent environment settings. So within all of the other tabs of a global material, those are going to be transferred over, but the alpha boost and environment settings are independent of the layer. I'm going to go back to the sphere layer and also take the default material on there and darken it and desaturate a little so we can see the snow a bit more. Now what I want to do is use the collision of the snow to define exactly where the snow is showing up on these objects by controlling the alpha with collision density. So first what we need to do is enable collisions. So we can go to the atmosphere editor, and under the rain and snow tab we can enable collisions. And if I go to edit, we can open the rain and snow collision settings where we have resolution of the effect, and the default tends to work pretty well. Unless you're working with a larger scene, then you would increase the resolution, but anything lower, it's going to create a very pixelated look. The fade rate, which right now is set to 0, is basically how quickly once a particle hits an object, how soon before it is removed from this collision effect, and we'll see the input in just a moment. And then also the maximum impact. I'm going to go ahead and increase that to 1,000. We also have an option to store impact energy, so it's based on more of the speed in which the particle collides with the object. Now at the moment this isn't going to generate any sort of data for our alpha because we don't have collisions turned on. So what we need to do is enable collisions for these objects. So I'm going to select the ground plane, and from the object properties in the aspect tab we can enable collisions. We can also go up to object and enable collisions. And if you're using Extreme Integrated plugin, you can just open the object properties to get this aspect tab and enable the collisions, which is the lower right button. So when collisions is enabled, once we render, it's going to compute the physics and exactly where the collisions are going to take place for each of the particles, and then we'll be able to access the atmospheric density. So right now we're not going to see the effect because it's not applied as of yet to the material. So since it's a global layer, it doesn't really matter which one we select. I'm going to select the sphere, edit the material, go to the alpha production, and I'm going to right click and add an input node, and we're going to find that there's an atmospheric particle collision density. There's also a regular particle collision density, and that's just if you're working with regular particle systems that are baked, and then you can choose which particles you want. But atmospheric will automatically collect the data from the atmosphere. So if we take a look at the output for this input node within the function node preview, we can see all of the collisions, and that's going to include everything within the precipitation area. So if we connect our alpha to this, we are going to need to make a few modifications. So what we want to do is add a filter, and we're going to set this to map. And our lower value for the input range is going to start at 0, and then it will raise up a little higher depending on the impact value that I have set up, the maximum impact, also the frame range, and it can also have to do with the resolution. Sometimes you'll get a value that's all the way up in the several hundred. In this case, it looks like we're really only going above 1 a little bit. So for the map value, 0 to 1 for the input range should be okay. We're going to go ahead and flip the output range, 1 to -1, because black is the area that shows through for alphas within the materials in the function editor. And what we'll start to see, let that render out, we can see the precipitation area, which does start to cut off. So one thing you can do, which I just suggest is a little bit easier, unless you're starting off with no snow at all, is to have another layer underneath this one, another snow layer, which will cover more of the scene, and then you can have it start to build up a little bit more on top of the layer that's underneath it. Now it's very blurry, the way the resolution is set up on this, and you could modify the alpha a little further to either make it a little sharper on the edges. We could take the map, the lower value, and cut it a little higher, setting it to maybe 0.5 instead of 0. And now we see more of a kind of splotches kind of showing up, where it has to reach a certain amount of collisions before it really starts to be defined. And of course, the further we scrub throughout the scene, the more cover we're going to see, because there's going to be more impacts, depending, of course, on the fade rate. Fade rate is set to 0. So basically, once an impact is calculated, it's going to basically stay there. It's not going to fade away. Now another thing that's kind of neat is if we go to the atmosphere editor and we set up a falling angle, let's just set it to a little over 20 degrees, and then we can also adjust the direction of the wind. I'm just going to leave it at 0. What we'll see is an area that's being blocked by the sphere because of the collisions, where the snow is not going to show up. So as long as there are objects blocking the collisions, in this case the sphere is blocking collisions on the ground, we won't see the snow collecting on the ground where it's being blocked. And it is a three-dimensional effect, the volume that's generated from the atmospheric collision density. Now, it's not going to affect ecosystems. It does have to be an object with collisions enabled, and you can't do that for ecosystem instances. So it does have to be an actual object. You can convert ecosystems over to objects and then enable collisions if you want to have maybe snow showing up on a tree or something like that. Now the snow itself doesn't look very real because of the way it's being cut. So what we can also do is add in a Grainy Fractal. So add a fractal node, Grainy Fractal, increase the roughness and decrease the scale. May add a little gain to it, just so it's a little bumpier. And then we could connect this to the lower value or the upper value. And I'm going to go back and bring down that input range. I should probably switch that connection to the Grainy Fractal. But this gives you an idea how you can kind of mix it up a little bit and still have it kind of show in other areas, and then start to increase the density with the collisions. And I've just loaded in one of the included example scenes, example included with the training. just to show something that looks a little bit better. And you can see how you can kind of mix the snow with the collision density, make it look a little bit better. And there we can see the snow building up. It looks a little more realistic than before. And there are a couple of different example scenes you can take a look at with different material types for the snow, different impact values as well. And here's another example scene where I have the dead tree species loaded in, acting as a collision object, and also with that snow material layer applied to it. And basically the ground and the sphere and the tree all have that global material snow layer using the atmospheric collision density to control where the snow is showing up. Some pretty neat things you can do with it. Keeping in mind that you do need to make sure that the precipitation area is large enough to encompass the areas of the scene where you want this effect to show. And this is a render of basically the same setup, but using a rain layer in order to make the layers underneath it look wet. And then I've also got an animated sequence of ripples playing within that layer to affect the bump so that it looks like water is kind of splashing onto it. And that layer, if we take a look, is basically just a black layer with transparency, and then also I've got a refractive index set up, same as water, 1.333, or 1.33 in this case. And then when you have that set up for this kind of flat layer, what it does is it incorporates the bump with the underlying layer and then creates a nice blend. So the effects setup, same diffuse and ambient as normal, but basically it's just a black layer. Alpha boost is down just a little bit, a lot of highlights, and then the bump is connected to a projected animation map of ripples just kind of showing up like raindrops. And then that's just repeated throughout the scene. And then I'm just kind of mixing multiple ones together with a little bit of offset to kind of fill in the area so it doesn't look like a seamless map. Basically set up same way as the snow layer.